So I'm going to try to not have to use the microphone. Just wave your hands if it's not loud enough for you. Thank you. Oh, yes, I forgot. All right. So I am the rare plant botanist for Texas Parks and Wildlife. I took Jackie Poole's place, for those of you who knew Jackie Poole. I am Jason Singhurst's coworker. So that's how I'm oriented in the world. I want to thank first Wally for asking me to give this talk. I've already given it to the Cactus and Succulent Society about a year ago, so I hope you didn't see that. It's a little bit of a repeat. And also I want to thank the Houston chapter of the Native Plant Society for welcoming me. So before I was a rare plant botanist at TPWD, I worked for them as a contractor. I did basically the same job in some capacity. And the project that I work on was funded by Endangered Species Grant Funding, which is what this is sort of indicating right here. I did it for 2 years, and I turned in a big report, and this is basically what that was all about. Since then, I have continued to work on these same species, but mostly in a field capacity way. So the project itself was essentially compiling information and summarizing information about a dozen rare plant species in the state of Texas to help inform listing decisions by Fish and Wildlife Service. And so, just so you know, I don't make any of these decisions about listing, but I do have a lot of things to say about each of these species. So the reason this was important was because 10 and 7 years ago, 2 nonprofit organizations petitioned in very large petition packages 400 plus species in different areas of the United States. In the Southwest, it was Earthwatch Guardians, and they requested that all G1 species in the southwestern United States be considered for listing on the Endangered Species Act. And this had basically never been done before. All 400 species, and then soon after, the same thing happened with Center for Biological Diversity, where they asked for all the G1s and G2s. These G rank classifications, they are status ranks. So basically it means a global status rank. G1 being the most rare species in the entire world. G5 is the maximum number for G ranks, and that would be the most common species in the world. So we at Texas Parks and Wildlife now track G1s to G3s. For plants, it's about 440 species, so the state of Texas probably should be more. But this is what caused this project to occur. Fish and Wildlife Service then had to determine if all almost thousands of these species, if they should be put onto the endangered species list. And basically, I said, aha, I have a job. There is limited staffing on both the Fish and Wildlife Service part and Texas Parks and Wildlife's part, and so they contracted out to me to do the summarization and compilation of information, basically all the information that I can find on a dozen of the species. Now, there's actually at least 5 more plants that I didn't write reports on, and that's simply because I didn't think they'd give me that much money. Eventually, the Fish and Wildlife Service will ask Texas Parks and Wildlife, as well as others, for the information that they know on these species. They will initiate what I'm informally calling a status review. There is a slightly different process that the Fish and Wildlife Service has started in the last few years, which wasn't in place when I started this project, but it's basically the same kind of information that they're asking for. So they require what they call sound scientific data that is the most up-to-date and the most accurate, and that's what I was trying to provide them. One thing that's kind of funny about the Fish and Wildlife Service is that they can assign very quick turnarounds for the information that they are soliciting, and so I wanted TPWD to be prepared for that request. So the problem is, at TPWD, we have what we call the Texas Natural Diversity Database, and this database has a backlog of information, and that's because it's been in existence for 30, 40 years. There are 1,300 rare species currently considered rare, plants and animals, that the state of Texas tracks. There are something like 5 biologists that collect information on, if not a daily basis, certainly a weekly basis, and there's about half the number of that data managers that put the data into the database. And so this is all mostly locational information and biological information that we know of for these tracked species in the state of Texas. And so we simply can't keep up with the massive amount of information. The other problem with that, obviously, would be that this would limit the accuracy of status reviews if they simply asked the database for the information. It would also make me have to scramble like a chicken with its head cut off if they said, can you provide us all the information for the species that you have in-house right now, because it's in filing cabinets, electronic files, various places that I would then have to compile and try to send to them and figure out what was the important stuff to send to them. So what did I do? As I've said, I basically prepared this information. I've compiled it into a logical format for entry into the database. I did not actually do any of the entering of the data into the database because I'm not trained to do that, and it actually takes quite a bit of time to learn how to do that. But I wanted to get it in a form for the database managers so they could easily take it and then put it in the database when they had time to do so. Another thing that I wanted to do was solicit anybody out there on the landscape that were professionals in these particular species. That doesn't mean they had to be a professional botanist, but it did mean that they had to be working on the plant in some capacity or had some sort of information about the plant. And then also I wanted to do some field work. So I wanted to be able to go out and try to update some of these locations that hadn't been visited in a long time, to see what the status of the species was on the ground at that moment in time. And then finally, the big hairy part of this project was the actual reports themselves. So I basically wrote many theses on each of these species. So it was a written report about the species for a dozen plants in the state of Texas. Oh, and before I describe what is in those status assessments, I want to point out to you, this is the range of all 12 of those species. So field work, as y'all might imagine, is a little bit complex when you're one person, or two, if you count Jason, to do all of the rare plants in the state of Texas. So we were doing quite a bit of range. And I've now gone to most of those counties, but not all of them. So the primary product, as I said, was what I'm calling a status assessment. And this was modeled after a 1981 chapter in a book by Helianthus called Rare Plant Conservation. And this was sort of just one of those very informal or informative books that described what's the kind of information you need to know about a plant to determine something like listing status. So what did I include in this? It was historic and current population information, which would include land ownership at the time. Also, if there was any surveying or monitoring data that had been collected in the last 30+ years that we knew about, trends in the population, which is fairly hard to come by, but if I found that, that would be good. The current status, so what is it doing on the ground right now? And then more basic information, like a species description, or what is it easily confused with, what other similar co-occurring plant species that could look like it. Also, I wanted to talk about the habitat. So geology, geography, what its distribution would be in the state of Texas and beyond, the soils that it occurs over, any kind of environmental abiotic factors like precipitation and temperature, if I felt like it was relevant, and then dominant co-occurring plant species that are recorded with the species, the target species I was looking at. And then the list continues: life history, disease, predation, any kind of conservation efforts that have been conducted for this particular species, and threats. So, as I've already kind of hinted, there were many benefits, and one including the fact that I would basically do part of what the data managers would have to do anyways eventually. They have to gather all the information, put it in a form that's archived, and then extract the relevant information for the database. The database is geographically emphasized. I don't even know what that means. So basically, location, location, location. That is the most important thing for the database in terms of you have to prioritize. We have so much information, you can't put in simply journal articles that talk about germination. Unless that germination occurred on a site out there in the wild, it was less important. So I wanted to put it two basic folders, one location-based, one non-location-based, so they could get to that information easily and put it in the location information first. I wanted to provide Fish and Wildlife Service with the most accurate, up-to-date information that we could have at that point in time, so they could decide listing status. If the status is, or if this plant is eventually listed, then it theoretically could also inform planning, managing, restoring the population. And then finally, and this is with a caveat, when the data is entered into the database, and if it is publicly available, so that means that, as we all know, Texas is 95% privately owned, and when I go onto a landowner's property, I have to get what is basically a landowner permission form for me to not only collect the data that I'm collecting about the plant species of concern, but I also give them the option to sign that information off as public or private. And if they sign the private line, then the only thing that happens to that data is that I put it into a report and I put it in the database, and that's it. It just lives in the database, and maybe in my brain. But the problem with that is that it never gets out to the database users, and the database users are people like, and this is about 95% of the users of the database, TxDOT. They are some agencies, but mostly they are contractors. They're people that are developing across the state. And so they are supposed to solicit TXNDD, the database, for information before they widen a road, build a pipeline, to see what they are going to destroy as they go through the landscape. And if that landowner says, nope, I want the information to be private, then they don't know what they're destroying. So when the information is in the database, if it's a publicly available data, then the information is available to the TXNDD users. So as I said, that's mostly developers. A small fraction are conservation professionals, university professors that are researching particular plants. So this is the reason why you are all here, right, is to look at plants. So the first three species I did not do field work for, and partly because I just didn't have enough time, particularly when I started the project, to do field work on all 12 species and all the sites of those 12 species. So I had to prioritize. And basically, these species, I decided to simply write a status assessment for them. Hexalectris revoluta, or Chisos coral root, only occurs, at least currently, that we've seen in the last 30 years, in the Chisos Basin, so in Big Bend National Park. And so likely that is a population of plants that is more likely going to be able to be protected, because that is one of the things that the feds have to do. For bracted twistflower, it was a little bit of a different situation. A lot of people are working on this particular species, particularly field work oriented activities. And so I decided it's good compared to all the other species that I was looking at. So I decided, and that's basically what's happening with Navasota false foxglove also. So for the rest of the species, I did some amount of field work. And when I got hired on as a permanent employee of TPWD, that's basically what I've been working on, is the field aspect of this project. So to prioritize the field sites that I had to choose from, it was still too many, I decided to start with the easy ones first. So that meant that they were publicly accessible, which for the most part means that they're on TxDOT right-of-way, although some of them have occurred on WMAs, state parks, etc. So I also wanted to look at the older sites, the ones that hadn't been seen in maybe 20, 30 years. I wanted to see if they were there anymore. And then finally, I would prioritize ones just because I wanted to learn the plant before I went out and did either of these two things. You know, it was a reliable site. I could go figure out what the actual thing looked like in person, be able to tell what it was. And so I went to those sites. So the actual species, I'm going to move from east to west and then south. So there's some amount of rhyme or reason to the way that I'm going through these species. It's not alphabetical, as you can already tell. So Texas Trillium is in northeast Texas. There are 20 known sites, currently known sites of this species. I've only relocated 4 of them. The majority of these are on private forestry lands. Fortunately for Texas Trillium, it occurs in wetland areas, and that is one of the things that forestry companies have to follow the rules, is that they can't log up to and in wetland areas. And so this is sort of by accident protected by the forestry companies, and they let us out there and we can survey. So I did that, and I also went to a lot of what I'm calling negative sites. And you'll see this a couple more times, but just know there are negative sites for every single one of these species, and lots of them. As a rare, I guess, plant or animal biologist, you get used to disappointment. You just have to have a really positive attitude and come home empty-handed a lot. But in this particular instance, I only found 11 negative locations. Most of these were on private property or on TxDOT right-of-way. Another, maybe I should be, I don't know if you can read this, but negative also could mean failed to find. So it's a location that was previously known in the past. I didn't find plants at that moment in time that I went. Doesn't mean that that population is extirpated, but it does mean that it wasn't there when I visited the location. Or it could mean I thought it was potential habitat and I didn't find anything. But nothing had ever been seen there before. Rough stem aster is a little bit west of Texas Trillium. I only found 14 negative sites for this particular species. Of the 31 known sites, I did find 9 sites of this particular species, mostly on TxDOT right-of-way, and most of these had not been seen since pre-1994. And the reason for that, or I guess mid-90s is what I said, the reason for that is that this particular species had a report written on it by my predecessor, Jackie Poole, and in those days, we didn't have ArcMap so much. We didn't have a software that we could basically predict where species occur on the habitat before we knew where, when we didn't know all of its range. So instead of layering all these maps on top of each other to figure out electronically where the best places to go to find this plant, she said, well, all of the known sites are within 60 miles of Tyler, Texas, so I'm going to stick in that range. They occur on wetlands, so I'm going to go to wetlands, and I want to be able to access it, so I'm going to TxDOT right away. So basically that narrowed the sites down to something like 7,000 sites. And she had 2 weeks to do her work, so she had to narrow that down to something like 450 sites. She literally went to 450 sites in a 2-week period. God bless her. And she found, dun-da-da-da, 10 sites. So that's like a 1% success rate. So, but she upped the number of known sites by almost double at that point in time. So that's why a lot of them hadn't been seen since the early 90s, before I started this work. Oops. Right. Okay, so the next species is in northeast Texas, but it's also in one county in the hill country. Small-headed pipewort. It's a tiny little guy. It's about 3 inches tall. It's like that big. It has small heads. So I've only been able to visit 2 of the 10 locations. Both of these had been seen sort of more recently, but this was one of those ones that I felt like I got to go learn this species before I do some really serious searching. It is hard to see. One new site has been seen since, or found since we started this project. It was by Jason. And I just you can't really see these habitat pictures very well, but I wanted to point out to you that the East Texas versus Central Texas habitats are very different from one another. This is granitic outcropping in the hill country, and then we have sort of these sandy bogs in East Texas that it occurs in. And it also occurs in Georgia on the same granitic outcropping as it does in Texas. It has a very interesting distribution and habitat. Shinner's sunflower. This species is in the Houston area. There are something over 30 known sites. I'm not exactly sure on the number. Most of these have been found on TxDOT right-of-way, and many of them, this is the pre-1994 one. I knew there was one. This one hasn't been seen. Many of the sites have not been seen since pre-1994. I've relocated 4. Haven't gotten very far in this one. I can tell you about that and why later. But 3 new sites have been found in just the last few years since we've started to work on this plant. And one of the reasons that it was seen in the pre-90s, and people were talking about Helianthus species. So the USDA actually went out and did a lot of surveys in Texas and beyond with different Helianthus species. And this was one of the ones that was up for consideration in terms of hybridizing with Helianthus annuus, the common sunflower, which gives us our sunflowers and our sunflower oil, etc. And this particular plant has a lot better pest resistance than the Helianthus annuus does. So they were looking into possibly hybridizing it, and it didn't come to anything. But anyways, the USDA had actually done quite a bit of work on this particular species back in the day. And you can't see this, but I just have to point this out. This is bold and has exclamation marks. And of all of these sites that I have been involved in so far with this group of plants, this is the one new site that I was there to find. So I want some credit for that one. Though, actually, I have to tell you a funny story with this one. I was out with Bill Carr, for those of you guys who know Bill Carr. He used to be a TPWD botanist as well back in the 90s. And we were along a right-of-way. And it was probably about there. It was like Colorado County, and we saw the plant at one site, and we went to another site, and we did some field work and collected some data. And as we were driving back to that first site to go home, we could see the mowers mowing it down. It's kind of like, oh, well, okay. Fortunately, it has these great basal rosettes that you can't see very well, the leaves, and they persist from year to year to some extent. Anyways, Indiana Jones, right? So Correll's false dragonhead, which, I don't know, has to be one of my least favorite common names. So I call it Physostegia. It's much more sexy. The only work that I have done on this particular plant is in Austin. So for those of you who know Austin, Ladybird Lake, or as I know it, Town Lake, This plant occurs on the banks of the river that goes through town. It's all one, what we call population. And in 2013 and 14, in conjunction with a consultant from San Marcos, his name is Casey Williams, he was doing literally paddling up and down the entire banks from the Miller Dam, which is the south end of Lake Austin, all the way to Pleasant Valley, or the Longhorn Dam, so east of downtown. I don't know what the mileage is for that, but it's quite a bit of ways. So it took, you can see each one of these sets of colors was a different day that Casey took his GPS out there. And we found a few extra sites that we didn't know about before, and updated some others that we did know. So that was fun. You get to go to work and go kayak and get paid for it. Yes?
Do front yards count too for sites? People's front yards?
And we debate about this in terms of our own information. There have been instances where we've considered putting, because we know of a site actually for this particular species, that somebody planted it, and we kind of like, well, it's not really a natural site. We don't know where the seeds came from. But it does actually occur upwards in more central Austin, and that site certainly is mapped. It is not a garden, though. It's actually a natural site, and it's probably gone by now because it was sort of in a channel. So big red sage, probably some of y'all have heard of this one. It's fairly popular in the horticultural trade. I've only been able to visit 2 of the 20 sites that are known of this species. Part of the I guess, de-emphasis that I have not worked on this species as much, partly because in 2013, Botanical Research Institute of Texas did a big report for us where they visited every single site known at that point in time and updated the information. So I've not been concentrating on the species as much. However, a master naturalist in the hill country did find a new site for us, got us on the property, all great stuff. Really motivated individual. And this is one of those species that you want to work on, right? I mean, it's got beautiful waterways, you know, the classic picture of the hill country. So now we're in West Texas. Tharp's blue star. It is only known from one single site in the state of Texas. It is also known in New Mexico a little bit more extensively. But there's a large gap. As you can see, it's in Pecos County. I can't remember, it's something like 150 miles from the site in Texas to the closest New Mexico site. So it is on TxDOT right-of-way and adjacent UT lands property. And this species, a report was written in 1997 along with about 29 other rare plants that were known to occur on TxDOT right-of-way. And at that point in time, what they were looking at was trying to recommend management for TxDOT for rare plants on right-of-ways. So what happened is that they went and tagged individual plants and tracked them through time, or at least areas of plants if they were annuals. And so they were able to collect at least 4 or 5 years of growth rate of those plants and reproductive output. And what was great about that is that in 2015 or 2016, when I went out and visited this right-of-way, I was able to find the exact plants that had been tracked, and it had been 15 years at least since they had been measured. The reason I was able to find them is because it's a perennial. Its rootstock is enormous. I mean, this thing is like that big around, and the majority of its growth is underground. So 2 things I learned about that is that it can live for 20 years plus, and also that management matters. Some species love mowing, and this is one of those species. Look at its native habitat. There are no grasses, and that's asphalt. This is the right-of-way. It's got runoff, and it has no mowing, and that is partly because we recommended no mowing, and that's because we thought the mowers were too low, and they would hack off the rootstock and kill the plants, but that's probably not in fact the case with this one. So what's happening is that they're still there. They're alive, but they're really not reproducing. If you look at the plants in the right-of-ways, they have flowers, no seed. The ones adjacent in this kind of habitat, abundant seed. So there you go. Lesson learned. Brush pea, this is one of my favorite plants. And the reason is this. This is the plant. This is how I've seen it. I have not seen, you can barely see this, but here's the flower, right? It's got little tiny pea-like flowers. It's in the legume family. It's in arid West Texas, and so monsoon rains are probably, this kind of time of the year is the time of the year that you're going to see flowering and fruit and leaf production. It is a drought deciduous plant, and so you get good at being able to identify sticks. And that's what we did. I mean, it kind of sounds depressing and ridiculous, but we were able to locate 2 sites that had not been seen since 1990. We got access to private property, which was a big plus. They said, here, take our data, and they allowed us to have it be public. So all pluses in our mind. And we were able to update the information for the first time in 25 years. Plus, it is a hard species to look for. These slopes are rocky and thorny and steep. I got Jackie to go out there twice with me. We'll see if she'll return the 3rd time. But the total number of plants for the state of Texas, it also occurs in Mexico, is 50. It's a big 50. So, okay, so maybe this is my least favorite common name. Paronychia congesta, now we're down in South Texas. It's in Jim Hogg County. There's only 2 sites very close to one another. We were with the help of the wildlife biologist in Jim Hogg County. He was a local resident. He's been working there as a wildlife biologist for a few years. He knew the private landowner that had, in the past, allowed us to see it in 1994. She changed her mind in 1994 and said, I don't want you to come out anymore. So we hadn't seen this plant in 20+ years, but with the help of this wildlife biologist, he reestablished the relationship, convinced her that, or maybe he didn't convince her, maybe she just said yes. And so we were able to go back and find this plant. This is all, I love the ugly ones. This is also my favorite plant. It has these little tiny, like 3 millimeter big or wide lemon yellow flowers. The whole thing is about 3 inches and it mostly just looks like dead, you know? I mean, it's, you gotta look at it really closely. It does occur on these fabulous volcanic tuffs, so it's basically like cemented ash. So that it's pretty easy to see their habitat. And then you gotta find the plant. So finally, prostrate milkweed is in 2 counties in South Texas. There are 14 known sites. I have been able to relocate 5 of them, and most of these are on TxDOT right-of-way. There's one at a Fish and Wildlife Service National Wildlife Refuge. This plant loves disturbance, I gotta tell you. I mean, I had a hard time finding a good habitat photo of this one because this is actually a dirt road. It loves roadways so much that one of my colleagues calls this plant Firestone plant because it's found in the middle of a lot of ranch roads or cattle paths. It does not like buffalo grass, and that's probably the main problem with this plant. Other than it occurs in very low numbers when you do find it. So I don't know if y'all know buffalo grass, but it's basically like King Ranch bluestem of South Texas. It's everywhere, and it's out-competing lots of things, including likely prostrate milkweed. We went to a lot of sites that used to have prostrate milkweed and simply didn't find it there. And I mean, it was hard to see much of anything because the buffalo grass is so thick. And buffalo grass was planted along much of the right-of-way in South Texas, and so that makes up a lot of what's there. And I just want to point out again, you know, very low numbers. We've been able to locate maybe 2 sites a year, maybe 3 max. Each one of those sites has basically 1 or 2 plants, except for, dun-da-da-da, this past April, I found one population of 16 plants. And I just about had a heart attack when I saw 16 plants. It's a problem. When you find it, you feel really great, and then you're like, wow, that was the one site I'm going to see this year. So this one requires a lot of work to be able to find. So here is my to-do list. I'm going to start from the bottom. There are 2 species that I would still like to write status assessments for. I haven't gotten to them. There are 2 that are familiar to you because I've just talked about them. There are others that are on this list that I probably won't get to at all, but I'd still like to write status assessments for these 2. One species I didn't talk about at all is Paronychia texana, and I was talking to Anita Tiller from Mercer earlier today, and so this is the plant right here. I just haven't gotten myself motivated to get excited about this one. I mean, it is a hard plant to find. Hard. And I like a challenge, but I just haven't worked myself up to it yet. It'll come. Okay, so the other thing is that Fish and Wildlife Service now has a work plan for all of these species, including the plants and animals. And so in terms of some of that emphasis of where I've spent my time, that is now directed by the work plan. So some species are going to come up in the next 2 years. I am now concentrating solely on those species. There are some that we won't get to until 2022, so I'm going to not work on those for a few years. I got enough to do. That's fine. So in case you ever want to come and help look for rare plants for me, these are the thousands of people that have helped with all of this work. I want to thank, in particular, Fish and Wildlife Service for the endangered species money that was shuttled through TPWD. TPWD also provided some of the fieldwork funding early on before I was actually hired on. And the TPWD biologists, they have really helped out. They are on the ground. They have relationships with landowners in the counties that they work in, and they are a great help for us back at the main office who don't work in necessarily the areas that we are doing our field work. And finally, of course, I want to thank the private landowners. You know, we can't do what we're doing without access to these properties. So thank you.